January 17th, 1945. Western Front. Belgium. The snow fell in silence across the Ardennes forest, dusting the skeletal pines and abandoned half-tracks with a thin white shroud. Oberstleutnant Friedrich Kessler stood at the window of a requisitioned farmhouse near the crossroads of Bastogne, staring out at the frozen fields beyond. His breath fogged the glass. In his hand, a single sheet of paper trembled, not from cold, but from the weight of what it represented. It was a fuel requisition report. A column of numbers that told a story no propaganda minister could spin, no general could ignore. The Wehrmacht's armoured spearheads, those instruments of lightning war that had carved through Poland, France, and deep into Soviet soil, had ground to a halt. Not from lack of courage, not from inferior tactics, but from something as mundane and merciless as gasoline, or rather, the absence of it. Outside, across the snowy ridgeline, Kessler could hear the distant rumble of engines. American engines, endless, methodical, unstoppable. Convoys stretching back to the channel ports like iron arteries pumping fuel, ammunition, food, and steel into the veins of an army that seemed to grow stronger with every passing day. He had spent his entire career perfecting the calculus of movement. How many tons of fuel per kilometre? How many litres per panzer division? How to stretch supply lines across conquered territory like taut wire. But now, as he looked at that paper, Friedrich Kessler understood a truth that would haunt him long after the guns fell silent. The age of blitzkrieg was over, and it had been killed not by Allied tanks or aircraft, but by something far simpler and far more devastating: American abundance. In the autumn of 1939, when the Wehrmacht rolled into Poland with mechanical precision, the doctrine of blitzkrieg was not merely a tactic, it was a philosophy. Lightning war, speed over attrition, concentrated armoured thrust supported by dive bombers, slicing through enemy lines before they could coalesce, encircling entire armies in pockets of confusion and collapse. The architects of this doctrine, Heinz Guderian, Erich von Manstein, and others, had studied the failures of the Great War and concluded that mobility was the antidote to stalemate. Keep moving, bypass strong points, strike deep, force the enemy to react faster than their command structure could manage. It was elegant, it was revolutionary, and for a time it was unstoppable. But there was a silent partner in every blitzkrieg operation, one that rarely appeared in the propaganda reels or the victory parades: fuel. Every panzer, every half-track, every reconnaissance vehicle, every motorcycle courier depended on gasoline or diesel. The Panzer III consumed roughly 90 litres per 100 kilometres on roads, far more across rough terrain. A panzer division in full operational tempo could burn through 400,000 litres of fuel in a single day of sustained combat. Germany, a nation poor in natural petroleum reserves, had gambled its entire strategic vision on synthetic fuel production and the seizure of enemy reserves. In France, the gamble paid off. German columns captured French fuel dumps faster than they could be destroyed. In the Soviet Union, the initial advances were so swift that supply officers struggled to keep pace, but captured Soviet fuel and the shorter distances to targets like Minsk and Smolensk kept the panzers rolling. But by 1944, the calculus had shifted. The vast Soviet territories had been lost or burned. The Romanian oil fields at Ploiești, the lifeblood of the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht, were under constant Allied bombardment. Synthetic fuel plants in the Ruhr were reduced to rubble by American flying fortresses, flying in daylight formations so massive they blotted out the sun. And across the English Channel, an American war machine was awakening, one that operated on a scale German planners could scarcely comprehend. Friedrich Kessler had been trained at the War Academy in Berlin, where logistics were taught not as support functions but as the architecture of victory. He had believed, as many of his generation did, that German ingenuity and discipline could overcome material disadvantages. He had seen the charts, the production figures for Tiger tanks and Panther tanks, the deployment schedules for jet fighters. But there was one chart that had always troubled him, one that his instructors glossed over or dismissed with vague assurances. It was the comparison of fuel production. In 1943, Germany produced roughly 5.7 million tons of aviation and motor fuel from all sources, natural and synthetic. The United States, in that same year, produced over 200 million tons of petroleum products, The ratio was not 2-1 or even 10-1, it was nearly 40-1. And that was before accounting for shipments to Britain, the Soviet Union and the Free French. Kessler had dismissed the figures at first. Numbers on paper, he thought, did not capture the fighting spirit of the German soldier or the tactical brilliance of German commanders. But numbers, he would learn, had a way of asserting themselves. By the time of the Normandy invasion in June 1944, German panzer divisions were already operating on severely restricted fuel rations. Training exercises were curtailed. Operational manoeuvres were planned not around strategic objectives, but around available fuel stocks. Tanks were towed by horses to conserve diesel. Entire armoured units sat idle, waiting for fuel that never arrived. And then, in the hedgerows of Normandy, Kessler saw it for the first time, the convoys. They came ashore at Omaha Beach, at Utah Beach, at Gold and Juno and Sword. Trucks, thousands upon thousands of trucks, deuce-and-a-halfs, GMC 6x6s, Studebakers, Dodges, rolling off Liberty ships and LSTs in an unending parade. Each truck carried fuel cans, ammunition crates, rations, spare parts. They moved in columns that stretched for miles, organised with a precision that seemed almost inhuman. The Americans called it the Red Ball Express, a dedicated supply route that ran from the Normandy beaches to the advancing front lines, operating 24 hours a day. At its peak, over 6,000 trucks were involved, delivering up to 12,500 tons of supplies per day. German reconnaissance units, those few still able to operate, reported the convoys with a mixture of disbelief and despair. "They are like ants," one report read. "Destroy 10 trucks and 20 more appear. The road is never empty." Friedrich Kessler, attached to Army Group B under Field Marshal Model, was tasked with analysing the Allied supply network and identifying vulnerabilities. He studied aerial reconnaissance photographs, interrogated captured American supply officers, examined captured vehicles. What he found defied the principles he had been taught. The Americans were not operating on the edge of their logistical capacity, stretching supply lines to the breaking point as German doctrine dictated one should exploit. They were operating with excess. Redundancy was built into every layer. Fuel was stored not in carefully rationed depots but in vast tank farms that sprawled across liberated French countryside. Pipelines were being constructed, actual pipelines, laid across the ocean floor and then overland, pumping fuel directly from England to the advancing armies. The scale was staggering. By September 1944, the Allies had constructed a fuel pipeline network in France, totalling over 2,000 kilometres. German fuel logistics, by contrast, relied on railroads that were under constant air attack and horse-drawn wagons that moved at walking pace. But it was not merely the quantity that unsettled Kessler. It was the philosophy behind it. The Americans had designed their logistics not to enable blitzkrieg-style operations, but to sustain them indefinitely. German offensives were planned as sharp, decisive thrusts, reach the objective, secure the victory, consolidate. They were sprints, not marathons. The American method was different. Advance, establish a forward supply base, bring up fuel and ammunition, advance again. The front line moved not in leaps, but in a steady, grinding roll, like a machine that could not be stopped because it was always fed. Where German tanks were allocated fuel for specific operations, American tanks simply had fuel. Enough to manoeuvre, to probe, to retreat and advance again without waiting for resupply. It was, Kessler realised, a different conception of war. One that treated logistics not as a constraint but as a weapon in itself. The soldiers in the panzer divisions felt it first. Lieutenant Hans Schreiber, a tank commander in the 2nd Panzer Division, recorded in his journal an entry from August 1944, during the attempted counterattack at Mortain. "We were ordered to advance at dawn and retake the town from the Americans. Our fuel allocation was calculated to the litre, enough to reach the objective, engage, and hold position until resupply. No margin for error, no margin for manoeuvre. We advanced as ordered, engaged American infantry supported by tanks. But when we attempted to reposition after the first contact, we found ourselves unable. The fuel was not sufficient to both fight and move. We became stationary targets. American artillery found us within the hour. Of the 12 Panthers in my company, 7 were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because they could not move. The crew set demolition charges and withdrew on foot. I watched my tank burn and thought of the propaganda films we had watched in training, the ones that showed our panzers racing across open fields unstoppable. It was a lie, not because the tanks were inadequate, but because the fuel did not exist. This was the transformation that Friedrich Kessler documented in his reports, though he knew they would never reach the high command intact. The German soldier, trained to believe in the supremacy of movement and shock, was being forced to adopt defensive postures not by doctrine, but by necessity. The panzer divisions that had once represented the spearhead of conquest were being used as mobile reserves, rushed from crisis to crisis along the eastern and western fronts, each movement draining precious fuel that could not be replaced. Meanwhile, across no man's land, American armoured columns moved with a freedom that seemed almost casual. Reconnaissance units reported American tanks stopping in the middle of operations to refuel from trucks that appeared as if summoned. No waiting, no rationing, just an endless flow of 5-gallon jerry cans and fuel trucks that kept the Shermans moving. The psychological impact was corrosive. German soldiers began to speak of the American supply convoys with a kind of superstitious dread. They were not targets to be destroyed. Efforts to interdict them with airstrikes or commandos invariably failed. The losses were replaced before the smoke cleared, but symbols of an enemy that possessed resources beyond comprehension. "They fight with their factories," one captured German officer told his interrogators. "We fight with our blood. Blood runs out. Factories do not." In December 1944, Adolf Hitler authorized one final gamble, the Ardennes Offensive, Operation Wacht am Rhein. The objective was audacious: punch through the weakly held American lines in the Ardennes forest, drive northwest to Antwerp, split the Allied armies in two, and potentially force a negotiated peace in the west. It was to be a blitzkrieg in the classic sense, a return to the glory days of 1940. Every available reserve was scraped together. Panzer divisions were pulled from the Eastern Front. Fuel stocks were hoarded in secret depots. The plan was meticulous, and it was doomed from the moment it began. Friedrich Kessler was assigned to the operational planning staff for the 6th Panzer Army. He reviewed the fuel allocations and felt a cold knot form in his stomach. The panzers had enough fuel to reach the Meuse River, barely. The plan required that German forces would capture American fuel depots intact during the advance. Without those captured supplies, the offensive would stall before reaching Antwerp. When Kessler raised this concern with his superiors, he was told that the Americans, caught by surprise and retreating in disorder, would abandon their fuel stocks just as the French had in 1940. It was not a plan. It was a prayer. The offensive began on December 16, 1944. For the first 48 hours, it seemed the prayers might be answered. German forces achieved complete surprise. American units fell back in confusion. Panzer columns raced through the snow, bypassing strongpoints, encircling the town of Bastogne. But the American fuel depots did not fall. Engineers destroyed them before withdrawing, or defending units held long enough for supplies to be evacuated. The panzers rolled forward on dwindling reserves. By December 20th, the lead elements of the 2nd Panzer Division had reached the town of Celle, less than 10 kilometers from the Meuse River. They could see the bridge, and there they stopped, out of fuel, completely. American forces surrounded them within hours. The tanks, those proud symbols of German armoured might, sat motionless as American artillery pounded them into scrap. Other units fared no better. The 1st SS Panzer Division captured an American fuel depot near Büllingen on the 2nd day of the offensive. It was a moment of jubilation. Hundreds of thousands of litres of fuel, enough to push the advance forward. But the fuel was gasoline, not diesel. The Panther and Tiger tanks ran on diesel. The captured fuel was useless. The division sat for hours while engineers attempted to modify engines or find diesel reserves. By the time they moved again, American reinforcements had arrived. The window had closed. Friedrich Kessler listened to the radio reports from a command bunker near St. Vith, tracking the movements of units on a map with coloured pins. Each pin represented a panzer division, and one by one the pins stopped moving. Not because they had been destroyed, but because they had been starved. On December 22nd, Kessler received a report that the 116th Panzer Division had abandoned over 30 tanks due to lack of fuel. The crews had not been defeated in combat, They had simply run out of the means to fight. He thought of the American convoys he had studied, the endless columns of trucks, the pipelines, the redundancy, and he understood, with a clarity that felt like grief, that the Germans had not been outfought in the Ardennes. They had been outsupplied. Blitzkrieg required speed, and speed required fuel, and fuel required a logistics network that Germany no longer possessed, and perhaps never had on the scale necessary to contest a nation like the United States. There was an object that came to symbolize, for Friedrich, Kessler and others like him, the gulf between the two sides. It was not a weapon, it was a container, the American jerry can. The Germans had invented the design, a 20-litre fuel container with a robust pressed steel construction, 3 handles for easy carrying, and an ingenious air pocket system that allowed the contents to expand without bursting. It was a small masterpiece of engineering, designed for exactly the kind of mobile warfare Germany practiced. The Germans called it the Wehrmacht Einheitskanister, but by 1944 it was the Americans who wielded it by the millions. They had copied the design, improved the manufacturing process, and produced them at a rate that staggered comprehension. Over 19 million American-made jerrycans were manufactured during the war. They were ubiquitous. American soldiers used them not only for fuel, but for water, for oil, for any liquid that needed transport. German soldiers scavenged them from knocked-out American vehicles and treated them like treasure. Kessler acquired one in early 1945, taken from an abandoned American supply dump. He kept it in his office, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Each time he looked at it, he thought of the philosophy it represented. The Americans had not simply copied a good design. They had industrialized it, mass-produced it, distributed it without thought to scarcity because scarcity for them did not exist. The jerrycan was not special to the Americans, it was standard, and that was the difference. What Germany hoarded, America deployed casually. What German officers planned around anxiously, will there be enough fuel, enough ammunition, enough food? American officers assumed. The assumption itself was a weapon, because it allowed American forces to think not in terms of conservation, but in terms of application. How best to use our resources, not whether we have enough of them. One German lieutenant captured near the Roer River in February 1945 told his interrogators a story that Kessler later read in a translated report. The lieutenant had been part of a reconnaissance patrol that stumbled upon an American field kitchen during a night raid. They had expected to find a small bivouac, perhaps steal some rations. What they found instead was something closer to a restaurant. Hot food, real meat, fresh bread, coffee, canned fruit, being prepared in industrial quantities. The American cooks barely reacted to the German patrol's appearance, retreating calmly while the Germans stared in disbelief at the abundance. "We were starving," the lieutenant said. "We had been on half rations for weeks, and here was an enemy who fed their frontline soldiers better than our officers ate in Berlin. We filled our packs and withdrew, but the entire patrol was silent on the march back. We did not speak of what we had seen, because to speak of it would be to admit that we had already lost. You cannot defeat an enemy who does not know hunger." The war ended, as all wars must, though, not in the manner Germany had hoped. Friedrich Kessler survived the collapse of the Reich and spent 2 years in an Allied prisoner-of-war camp in France. He was treated well. The Americans, true to form, fed the prisoners adequately. Better, in fact, than many German civilians were eating in the ruins of their cities. During his captivity, Kessler was interviewed multiple times by Allied intelligence officers interested in German logistics and planning. One American major, a logistics officer himself, asked Kessler what he thought had been the decisive factor in Germany's defeat. Kessler considered the question carefully. He could have spoken of the two-front war, or the strategic bombing campaign, or the entry of the Soviet Union with its endless reserves of men. But he thought of the Ardennes, of the tanks abandoned for lack of fuel, of the jerrycan sitting on his desk, of the convoys rolling day and night through France. "Your fuel," he said finally, "you drowned us in fuel?" The American major seemed puzzled. "We had better tanks by the end," he said. "Better aircraft, better tactics." Kessler shook his head. "No, you had better logistics. Your tanks were adequate, but they always had fuel. Ours was superior in armour and firepower, but they sat motionless, waiting for fuel that did not come. A stationary tank is not a weapon. It is a coffin. You did not need to destroy us in battle. You only needed to move continuously without pause, and you could, because you had built a system that assumed abundance rather than scarcity. We built a system that assumed lightning would strike before the storm ran out of rain. But your storm never ran out of rain. After his release in 1947, Friedrich Kessler returned to Germany and eventually found work as a consultant for industrial logistics firms, rebuilding the shattered infrastructure of Europe. He never wrote a memoir, though he gave lectures occasionally at technical universities on the principles of supply chain management. In these lectures, he rarely spoke of grand strategy or battlefield heroics. He spoke instead of fuel consumption rates, of tonnage delivered per mile of rail line, of the mathematical elegance of pipeline construction, and always at some point he would project a photograph on the screen. An American convoy stretching to the horizon, trucks laden with jerry cans rolling through the French countryside under a clear sky. He would let the audience look at it in silence for a moment, and then he would say, "This is what victory looks like. Not a tank, not a bomber, but this. The capacity to move resources faster than the enemy can disrupt them. Everything else is commentary." There is a moment in history, small and easily overlooked, that captures the essence of what Friedrich Kessler came to understand. It occurred in late March 1945 as American forces crossed the Rhine River at Remagen. The crossing was hasty, opportunistic. A bridge that should have been destroyed remained standing, and the Americans poured across. German High Command ordered immediate counterattacks to collapse the bridgehead. Panzer units were dispatched, but they arrived piecemeal, delayed by lack of fuel, harassed by Allied airstrikes against fuel convoys. By the time the armour reached the Rhine, the Americans had already established a logistics base on the eastern bank. Fuel pipelines were being laid across the river. Trucks were ferrying supplies over pontoon bridges erected alongside the damaged rail bridge. Within 72 hours of the initial crossing, American forces had more fuel stockpiled on the eastern side of the Rhine than the defending German units had in total. A German staff officer, viewing reconnaissance photographs of the American bridgehead, made a notation in the operational log that has survived in archives. "Enemy has achieved in 3 days what would require us 3 weeks if fuel were available. Cannot contest. Recommend withdrawal." The bridgehead expanded, the counterattacks failed, and the American First Army began its drive into the heart of Germany, moving not in fits and starts, but in a steady, relentless advance fueled by a logistics network that, even in its final sprint, operated with surplus capacity. This was the transformation that Friedrich Kessler had witnessed. The death of Blitzkrieg was not a single dramatic moment, a great tank battle lost or a city fallen. It was an accumulation of small failures, each rooted in the same cause: tanks that could not maneuver, aircraft that could not sortie, convoys that could not deliver because the trucks themselves lacked fuel to make the journey. The German military had been designed as a precision instrument, a rapier meant to strike with devastating speed at carefully chosen points. But the Americans had approached war as a bludgeon, a massive, implacable force that moved forward not because it was swift, but because it could not be stopped. And the fuel, the endless, inexhaustible fuel, was the force that kept the bludgeon moving. In the decades after the war, military historians and strategists studied the German defeat from every angle. They analysed battles and campaigns, the decisions of generals and the failures of intelligence. But it was the logistics officers, the unsung technicians of war, who understood what Kessler had understood in that Belgian farmhouse in January 1945. Modern warfare was not won by the army that struck first or hardest. It was won by the army that could sustain its operations the longest. The Americans had not simply outproduced Germany, though they had by staggering margins. They had outthought Germany at the foundational level. They had built a military machine predicated on the assumption that supply would never be the limiting factor, and then they had made that assumption reality through industrial might and organizational discipline. The jerry can, that simple pressed steel container, became for Kessler a symbol of this philosophy. It was not glamorous, it did not win battles directly. But it enabled everything else. Every Sherman tank, every P-47 Thunderbolt, every Jeep and half-track and artillery piece depended on fuel delivered in those containers, carried by those trucks, pumped through those pipelines. The Americans had understood that victory in modern war required not just weapons, but the means to keep those weapons fighting. and they had committed to that principle with a totality that Germany, for all its tactical brilliance, never matched. There is an irony in this that Kessler appreciated, though it brought him no joy. The very doctrine that had brought Germany its early victories, blitzkrieg, the emphasis on speed and mobility, had sown the seeds of its ultimate defeat. By committing to a style of warfare that demanded enormous quantities of fuel, Germany had created a vulnerability it could not overcome. The Allies, by contrast, had adopted a slower, more methodical approach, not out of lack of imagination, but out of recognition that speed without sustainability was an illusion. The tortoise had defeated the hare not through superior speed but through endurance, and the fuel convoys, those mundane columns of trucks, were the embodiment of that endurance. Friedrich Kessler died in 1982 in a quiet suburb of Munich, largely forgotten by a world that had moved on from the war. His obituary in the local newspaper made no mention of his wartime service or his insights into the nature of logistics and defeat. But among his papers, found by his daughter during the clearing of his apartment, was a single photograph. It showed an American convoy identical to the one he had displayed in his lectures. On the back, in his precise handwriting, was a notation: the weapon that ended the war, not because it destroyed, but because it delivered. It is tempting to view the Second World War through the lens of its dramatic moments. The landings at Normandy, the siege of Stalingrad, the atomic bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. These were the events that shaped the narrative, the turning points that histories are built upon. But beneath those moments, often invisible to the participants and the chroniclers alike, was a simpler truth. Wars are won by the side that can put more steel, more fuel, more ammunition at the point of decision when the moment arrives. The Americans had understood this. They had built an economy and a logistics system designed not for dramatic strokes but for overwhelming, sustained application of force. And they had wielded that system with a ruthlessness that no amount of tactical brilliance could counter. The German soldiers who faced those fuel convoys, who watched the endless parade of trucks and pipelines and supply dumps, came to understand that they were not fighting an army. They were fighting an industrial civilization, one that had turned its entire productive capacity toward the singular goal of victory. And, against such an opponent, courage and skill were not enough. The Panzers could be the finest tanks in the world, and in many respects they were. But a tank without fuel is a monument, not a weapon. The Luftwaffe could field jet fighters years ahead of anything the Allies possessed. But without fuel to train pilots or sortie aircraft in sufficient numbers, technological superiority was meaningless. There is a question that hangs over the memory of Friedrich Kessler, and others like him, a question that historians and ethicists continue to grapple with. Could the war have ended differently if Germany had possessed the resources of the United States? If the fuel had flowed freely, if the factories had been safe from bombing, if the logistics had been adequate to the ambitions of the generals? It is a counterfactual that leads nowhere useful, because it ignores the fundamental reality. The war was not a contest of hypotheticals, it was a contest of actualities. And the actuality was that Germany, for all its martial prowess, had embarked on a war it could not sustain. The fuel shortage was not an accident or a failure of planning. It was the inevitable consequence of a strategy that demanded more than the nation could produce. The Americans did not simply have more fuel. They had built an economy and a society capable of producing more fuel, more steel, more everything, and then delivering it to where it was needed when it was needed without fail. This is the legacy that Friedrich Kessler left behind, not in his papers or his lectures, but in the understanding he reached during those cold months of 1945. The age of blitzkrieg had ended not because it was a bad tactic, but because it was a tactic that required conditions, abundant fuel, short distances, unprepared enemies, that no longer existed once the war became global. The Americans had not fought blitzkrieg with blitzkrieg. They had fought it with logistics, and logistics, in the end, was the more powerful weapon. The convoys rolled on, long after the guns fell silent. They carried not soldiers but reconstruction materials, not ammunition but food and medicine. The same trucks that had fueled the advance across Europe now fueled the rebuilding of Europe, and in this too there was a lesson. The capacity to deliver, to sustain, to provide. These were not merely military virtues. They were the foundations of a different kind of power, one rooted not in conquest but in creation. The fuel convoys that had broken the back of Blitzkrieg became, in peacetime, the lifelines of recovery. The jerrycans that had symbolized American abundance in war became the tools of American aid in peace. Friedrich Kessler, standing at that farmhouse window in January 1945, had glimpsed the future. A world where wars would not be won by the swiftest strike or the most daring maneuver, but by the steadiest hand and the deepest reserves. A world where the ability to move resources, to sustain operations, to outlast the enemy would matter more than any single battle. He had seen the convoys, and he had understood. The Blitzkrieg was over. The age of logistics had begun, and in the rumble of those American engines rolling endlessly through the snow was the sound of a new era, one that Germany had challenged and lost, not on the battlefield, but in the factories and the fuel depots and the unglamorous essential work of keeping an army moving, when the easy victories were gone, and only the grinding, relentless truth of industrial war remained.